First of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's been several years, actually, since I've spoken to Boerne Nipsot. So it's nice to have you here. Congratulations on being the chapter of the year. And then I know one of your projects that you work with, the Hill Country Master Naturalist, also was awarded a nice award by the Texas Master Naturalists group for your work with the PGARP program. So well done. And I'll just give it a plug, since our house happens to be one of those places that is proudly hanging that sign. So what I want to do tonight is talk a little bit about pollinators. I want to talk about pollination a little bit, how it works. Most of you know some of it, but you might not know all of it. And I don't know all of it, but we'll share a few insights. And then I want to spend the rest of the time talking mostly about some of the plants that I have experienced that seem to work really well for pollinators. And I'm sure most of them you will recognize, being the Native Plant Society. But hopefully we'll give you a few insights that will help. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and then I'm going to turn off my camera so that you don't have to look at this for the next 45 minutes. You can focus on the pretty pictures. So let's see here, that should do it. And let me know, what do you see? Oh, you're not seeing the right thing, are you? What are you seeing right now, Lorraine? Are you seeing the whole picture, or are you seeing the actual?
The full screen.
Full screen? Okay, it doesn't have the next slide notes over on the side, right?
No, it doesn't.
Okay, perfect. Because that's not what my screen is showing, but since it's the right thing, that's awesome. All right, here, so let me find out if I can hide my face. Of course, you know, finding that would be really simple, but let's see here. Well, for now, I'll keep it on. Anyway, because I can't find it, and I don't want to waste another minute. So anyway, so pollinators and native plants making connections. Obviously, you all know that native plants are great for our local pollinators, much better than a lot of the non-native things that are out there, simply because our native pollinators are adapted to what we have growing in the wild. And so I always advocate for the native plants versus non-natives. So tonight's agenda is just a little overview on pollination and who's who. Some of the pollinators you might recognize or not even know are really pollinators. And then also talk a little bit about how plants attract pollinators, and then take a look at some of the native plants that I typically focus on, and just through observation and taking photographs have kind of determined are really good ones, and that are also mostly actually available for purchase or for growing it on your own. And then I'll also hit a little bit on Seek and I Naturals, very little, but I don't want to spend too much time on that tonight, but I want to, since I work in that program, it's silly for me not to mention it. So first of all, just a brief overview of pollination services and pollinators. 75% about percent of all flowering plants require a pollinator, and a third of those provide humans food. And when they break it down, it's about 1 in 3 bites of food or drink require a pollinator. So obviously pollination services are incredibly important to our survival. And of course, pollinators not only feed birds directly and other wildlife directly by being eaten, they are also they are also indirectly providing food to those birds and other wildlife simply through their services. They're also, of course, helping species of plants propagate and go on to future generations. When we talk about pollinators, of course, a lot of that attention naturally focuses on bees. In the United States, there are over 4,000 species of native bees. That's a lot. Most of us think of the honeybee and stop about right there, but there are a lot of them out there. And they are really keystone species in that when you lose them, it starts to have a ripple effect through the ecosystem. So, and that's been proven across the globe. And as insect species continue to decline at fairly alarming rates on a global basis, it becomes more and more concerning as to what the future of pollination services and thus our food supply, if we want to boil it down to being selfish as human beings, that we need them. They're also indicator species. Generally, if you have good diversity of pollinators, you must have some kind of healthy ecosystem, regardless of where that is. And just as an example of what can go wrong in China's Sichuan province, and I'm going to show you just a real short video clip. The video clip probably won't play very well, and I apologize, but at least you'll get a feel for how desolate it is. their apple trees have to be pollinated by hand now because they literally wiped out all their native pollinators through chemical poisoning, and people that apparently are beekeepers there won't refuse to bring their bees there because of the toxicity of the environment. So, and just I'm going to go ahead and hit play on this, and it looks pretty darn bleak, I got to tell you. So I don't know how well that's going to play on your video screen, but again, they're literally having to dab pollen with a essentially a Q-tip onto the flowers one by one in order to have an apple crop, and they are apparently one of the biggest apple producers globally. So you can imagine what that would, how that would change our food production in the United States if we don't have pollinators. So anyway, I just wanted to share that, a little bit of that with you. Again, I don't know how well it played, but who knows. Well, anyway, so the goal of pollination, obviously it is to create new generations of the plants. So they're trying to get to a new crop of seeds so that they have new plants so they can continue on as a species. And of course, most of us think about pollination in terms of cross-pollination, where a bee or another insect or a hummingbird or a bat, depending on where you are in the world, picks up pollen from one flower and carries it to another flower of the same species. It happens to get on the stigma, the sticky part of the pistil, the female part of the flower. And then, of course, that's when pollination can happen and fertilization and all that good stuff. And but cross-pollination isn't the only way that flowers and plants reproduce. They can self-pollinate, and a lot of annuals actually self-pollinate. So, for example, they've done experiments with dandelions. You can cut off the stamens and the pistils, and they still produce flowers, believe it or seeds, believe it or not. But in order to prevent self-pollination, having the male flowers and the female flowers on separate plants, that of course would be one strategy. But if you have the flowers in the same plants or in the same flowers, the male and female parts, having the pistils ripen, if you will, or become receptive at a different time so that the pollen of that same flower has already been released, or the pistil becomes receptive before the pollen of that flower is released, then that's one way, again, to prevent self-pollination. Having pistils of different lengths. If you look at certain flowers, even like the primroses, the length of the pistils is vastly different than the length of the stamens, and that can help do that as well. And then also there's all kinds of chemical methodologies and games being played out there that prevent the pollen from either the wrong species or even the same plant from being able to successfully grow a tube for that pollen grain to be able to get down to the ovule for reproduction. So a lot of pollination, of course, is when we think of flowers, of course, we're thinking about animal pollination. And that's basically just physically moving pollen from one plant to another. One of the things to keep in mind that is not what a bee wakes up in the morning going, okay, I've got to go to this flower, I've got to move you know, an ounce of pollen from here to there, and then that way my job's done. I can punch the clock, go home, and have a beer. They're doing it because it's mostly accidental, to be honest with you. They're doing it because they're looking for the pollen, which is a great food source for larvae. They're also looking for nectar, which is a great food source for them. And so the reward of visiting those flowers is that nectar and that pollen. It's expensive for those flowers to produce, energetically wise. So the flowers have figured out, apparently, how to take advantage of the fact that they have these visitors taking advantage of the nectar and spreading the pollen from flower to flower. And these three pictures you see here, the carpenter bee, you can see on the forehead, there's a lot of pollen right there from that mealy blue sage. Here's a bumblebee flying off with its feet full of pollen, its tail full of pollen. And then here's a megachile, a leafcutter bee that has its pollen hairs on the underside of the abdomen and carrying the pollen that way. But there's also then pollen all over that hairy body as well. So it works out pretty good for everybody. Of course, that is not the only kind of pollination, and I think most of this season is over, so I don't feel too bad right now about putting that picture up. But a lot of plants use wind pollination, and of course, as a result of that, they have to produce massive quantities of pollen in order to get lucky enough that a pollen grain lands in the right place. Flowering plants that rely on pollinators can produce less pollen because there's a better chance it's gonna get from one place to the right, to the next place in good order by those pollinators. And of course, when you start thinking about grasses, of course have flowers. A lot of the general public doesn't realize this, that they have flowers out there. And you can see right here that we have this tall grama grass has pistils right up in here. It has stamens that hang down here so the wind can blow those around to other plants in the area for pollination purposes. And then side oats grama on the left. Also, you can see if we do a close-up right here, they're really kind of cool, especially under a microscope. These are the pistils right here, and then the stamens right here. So, and this, by the way, is, I should have you guess it, but because we're not in person, I'm not going to do that. This is a, so right there is a pollen grain, by the way, right in that middle picture right there, that little yellowish thing. This is actually an anther, and this is a part of a pistil from, oh my gosh. Oh, large grass, seeds look like corn. I'm gonna space it off, aren't I? Oh my gosh. Eastern gamma grass, sorry, had to look at my notes, just forgot. So that's what one pollen grain, or one, the end of one stamen actually looks like, the anther. And it has that little pore, and that's where those pollen grains fall out of right there. And then, of course, this looks like old rope to me, but when I put it under a microscope, I was shocked to see this. But again, this provides lots of surface area to catch a few of those pollen grains for pollination. So let's move on to the insect pollinators. There's lots of different ones. Bees are considered the best pollinator for plants globally, but there are other groups that do pollinate. Bees are pollinating, I don't want to say purposefully, but they're adapted to pick up that pollen and move it from flower to flower. But other things are pollinators, more incidental pollinators than purposeful, I guess you could say. The monarch butterfly, I've taken pictures of monarchs with a little bit of pollen on their proboscis right here. But you'll notice they're not hairy creatures, so they're not going to be picking up a whole lot of pollen to be spreading from one place to another. So it's more of an accidental pollination going on there with most of our butterflies. Moths, of course, and I'll be honest with you, this moth picture wasn't in here at 6:30, but at 6:45 it was, and it was done in honor of Mothman that's out there watching this program tonight. So I didn't want to discriminate against moths, so that's why I put that in there, the white-lined sphinx. Delmer, that's for you. And then, of course, there are flies that are actually pollinators. Some of them are hairy. They're bee mimics. And, of course, flies have typically very short antennae and only two wings, one wing on either side. And then they have these halteres, which are modified. There used to be wings, they say, and are modified organs for stability in the air. And then you have beetles that will do some accidental pollination. Again, most beetles are not hairy creatures, but they will drink nectar, they will gather pollen. And then different kinds of wasps. So this guy right here is a potter wasp, a type of potter wasp, or mason wasp, one of the two. But a beautiful little wasp. You'll see it visiting flowers. And again, incidentally, right there on its forehead, you can see down in the lower right-hand corner, there's pollen there from these frostweed flowers. And then up here, of course, are a couple of different kinds of bees. This was a pretty big bee. I saw it in Big Bend National Park. Because there are 4,000 species of bees in the United States, trying to get them down to species is pretty hard. And then bees range in size from the big bumblebees that we see, which can be an inch long, to these little itty bitty pollinators right here. This might be a Lasioglossum, but there are several others that look like this. But this is a flower of a Texas thistle, so you have an idea of just how tiny that pollinator is. So these pollinators are of all different sizes, incredibly variable, and incredibly important to the plants that we have here in Texas. I'm going to play this just for a second. Again, I don't know how well this is going to play, but I'm going to try to skip through this. This is, of course, an American bumblebee. This was the spring, the flower that it's nectaring on. This was actually in Honey Creek. Wilt, I know, and you and Terry lead hikes down there. It's real common in the springtime. The thing that's neat about this bumblebee, and I don't know if it's playing for you, it's playing for me just fine. But what's happening here is that marble seed has its flowers, has if you look closely at the flowers, if the camera ever stops moving so crazy, this is me doing this, you can see that there's a little stick-like thing sticking out of the flower. That's the pistil. And so what's happening is the bee is having to push its head there, right there. There's little powdery stuff flying out of the flower. And so notice the bee is upside down. The flowers are upside down. So when it goes into its head goes into the flower, the stamens are wrapped around on the inside of those petals. And it goes down to get the nectar down at the base of the flower, which is the top of the flower because it's upside down. And then it pushes, some of that pollen falls out. Not only does it fall on the belly, so that bee can take some of that pollen back, but when it's sitting right like that, and that pollen is on its belly, when it hits the sticky part of the stigma, it can pollinate the flower. And then because it's also throwing pollen through the air, by that flower having the stigma and the style outside the flower, it might actually be able to be pollinated by the wind moving some of that pollen that the bee is disturbing. So just kind of a neat deal. And again, I apologize if the video is not showing well. A lot of times it doesn't. But anyway, so that's just a great example of how pollination happens, where you get not only is the insect pollinating directly, but you get that indirect pollination, and that flower apparently is adapted to accept pollen from the air to help facilitate even more pollination success. So when you start talking about flowers, of course, one of the flowers groups of flowers I like to talk about the most is these guys. These are composites. And they come in all different sizes. And I want to talk a little bit about them because they're actually pretty fascinating when it comes to pollination. And of course, you have three different. Typically, you'll have flowers like this pincushion daisy that won't have any ray flowers. These are all disc flowers. They typically start blooming from the outside and work their way into the center. You can see a couple of little bugs here that are maybe accidentally moving pollen around. Then we have skeleton plant right here in the middle that has no disc flowers, only ray flowers. Most ray flowers end with, and here's a green thread. And again, this is one that has both. It has ray flowers and it has disc flowers. You'll notice that this is a typical floret, ray floret, and it typically ends with three little bumps or at the end of each ray flower. This one's a little bit different. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Notice that it has 5 little sharp points at the end of each of its ray flowers. So under a microscope, this is what they look like. This is the disc floret right here. Right here are the anthers. So the pistil actually grows up through the anthers. And this is the style branches. So this is the part where pollen, hopefully from another flower, will land to help pollinate that flower. But there are pollen grains right in here underneath this from these actual stamens. And we'll talk about how they get there and how they don't cross-pollinate in just a second. And then here's a typical ray floret. These are ray flowers. They are typically sterile, so they don't have a pistil or a stamen, but there are exceptions to that, and I want to show you those real briefly. So there are some that are referred to as bilabiate, both the silver puff and then also brownfoot. Brownfoot grows a little farther west of here. Silver puff is common in the woods, but typically this is how we see silver puff. Only one time, literally one time in my life, did I actually find a flower open on silver puff, and I was so thrilled. I went out and grabbed pictures as quickly as I could, but this is typically how we see it. But basically what that means is a bilabiate means that it has your typical, what you would normally see on a ray flower right here, and notice it's got three little points at the end. But then, and I'm going to have to show you a separate one. Here's an example here. But on the inside, it actually has another little ray flower attachment, but it only has 2 points on the end. So that's what's known as a bilabiate flower. Not very many of them have that, but that's one around here that does. And then of course, silver puff as well. And then ligulate. And remember I said a minute ago that these flowers, types of flowers have both stamens and pistils. So they are perfectly able to reproduce. But notice that they have 5 points at the tip of each of the ray flowers. So those are just some breakdowns of some of the different styles and complexity of composite flowers. And this is what I really want to show you. So when you think about, first of all, when you're trying to track pollinators, I'm always going to say plant composites, plant composites. Lots of flowers, compact on one head. A butterfly or a bee can sit on top of the head and dip its straw, proboscis, into multiple flowers at once. It doesn't spend a lot of energy doing that. It gets maximum amount of energy and can go on with its business. So plus most of them are pretty darn pretty. But the way it works, so this is under a microscope. This is a disc flower. Notice it's very, very beautiful disc flower. It's got 5 lobes. That's pretty typical. And it's got these little glands in here, and I'm not sure what the function of those are, except they're just kind of neat looking. And then we have the stamens right here, and they're basically in a tube like this. And the pistil, the style, will actually grow up through that. And the way this happens, and by the way, this came out of a wonderful book. Hopefully some of you have it. It's called The Sunflower Family. Let's see here. There we go. Get it over there. The Sunflower Family. Fabulous, fabulous book if you like composites. I recommend it strongly. But what happens here, and this is a diagram from that book. So here's the style right here. Here are the filaments that hold the anthers. And what happens is this filament grows up through here, and as it's growing up through here, these start to ripen on the inside of the stamen. So that starts to expose the pollen grains. And then as this grows, you can see pollen grains are starting to fall here, but they're also going out this way. And then as this grows up through here, it actually pulls, it uses little hairs to pull, they're called sweeping hairs, to pull out pollen grains right up in here. So it's on the outside of the style. So it's not self-pollinating, okay? But that's when the bees and the things can come along and get some stuck to their feet. And then eventually these begin to rot, and this then splits and opens, and all of the pollen grains from the inside those stamens are on the underside of the style branches here. And it's on the top of the style branches where you want the pollen from other flowers to land. Okay, so it's fabulous. It's just like poof, like this. When I read this the first time, I was just blown away. What a great way to pollinate flowers. And then, of course, if we move on to other types of flowers, you have milkweeds. And if you've ever heard me give the milkweed presentation, you know that they have pollinia, these little sac-like things that are actually in the flower, in the center of the flower here. And they are sticky. They have a little, they're winged like this. So they're 2 pollinia sacs that come out like this, and then they fold. And then what has to happen is these pollinia sacs, as the insect is moving from one flower to another, they have to actually fit into these 5 slits that are on this part of the flower. And that's how pollination happens. And how that ever happens is a miracle. But when you see a pod from a milkweed, that's from one flower, not all the flowers, one flower, and all of those pollen grains inside that pollinia that pollinated got somehow slipped into that one slit. It's just amazing how that happens. And of course, other flowers are communicating. They'll have different, the centers of the flower will be different colors than the rest of the flower. That's kind of, the bees see that in ultraviolet sometimes, so that they see it differently than we do. That's saying, hey, I'm here. Here's where all the nectar is. Come on down. To get it. So whether it's blue-eyed grass here or Alamo vine here. And then what's really cool, it even gets better, because a plant like this, Texas bluebonnet, you'll notice that the center of these flowers down on the lower part of the stem are purple. And then the ones on the top are white. But what this means is that the purple ones are telling the bees, hey man, I've already got pollinated. You don't need to come here. There's no nectar for you. So the bees then focus on the white, the flowers with white in the center. And first time I read this, I was like, oh, please give me a break. And I sat literally on I-10 south of Comfort in a roadside ditch when the bluebonnets were blooming like crazy. And I watched as bees pollinated these flowers, and none of them ever went to a flower that had a purple center. They only went to the flowers with the white centers. So apparently these plants are talking to the pollinators. And of course, other flowers, they will have their stamens exerted well beyond the scarlet musk flower here, columbine here, and then fucura, help me out here. I'm saying the genus name. Well, you know what it is. Out in West Texas. Doggone it. Hate it when I forget something like that. But anyway, they have their stamens well outside. It helps prevent self-pollination. And then when an insect comes in, they hit these pollen sacs, pick up some pollen, and can spread them from flower to flower. And of course, a flower like columbine is actually interesting because the nectar is clear up here. And so you have to have a very long tongue to get up here or be able to crawl inside each of these. And what some bumblebees will actually do, they cheat. They'll actually chew a hole in the tips of these because their tongue is not long enough, and they'll steal the nectar that way without ever pollinating the flower. So again, there's war games going on out there as well. Ocotillo, how could I not remember ocotillo? Anyway, and then of course there are flowers that have great arrangements. Here's some that have these nectar guides, these lines that are, again, the bees are seeing in a different color than we see. It pushes them into the flower to get the nectar. And when it happens, if you'll notice on this penstemon right here, of course, this is our Missouri violet, native violet. I found this growing in along the river at Guadalupe River State Park. And then we have these different penstemons. And sage right here, but notice right here, here are the stamens, and they're kind of cupped over like this. So when the bee goes in, the back of the bee hits those stamens, and that's what releases the pollen onto their back. And then here's the same arrangement here. Look at all the pollen that's actually fallen off this particular flower there. And then of course they create these beautiful little landing pads, so an insect can land here. And if you've ever tested that, a great one to do this with is, oh my gosh, snapdragon. If you take the side of a snapdragon flower and you squeeze it, you'll see that the lip goes down, and then out come the pollen grain or the stamens to tap the insect going in. What great plans that these plants have evolved over time to get pollinators there to be successful with reproducing generations. And then of course you have things like this. These members of the Solanaceae family, they need buzz pollination in order to have pollination. So these are the pollen sacs, these yellow things you see here, look like bananas almost, but there's a pore at the end of those. But in order for the pollen to get out, the bee has to get in there and do what's called buzz pollinating. This happens with tomatoes too, by the way. And I didn't know this. I never knew this. And then last spring I was hiking out at her farm, and I saw these bumblebees going to these buffalo burr flowers, and I started hearing a sound that was different than the normal bee flying sound. And you're going to have to turn the volume on your computer up. I don't know if you'll hear it, or even if this is my last video. I don't know if it works, but because I'm not even hearing it very well, unfortunately. So I don't even know if you're hearing that. But if you ever see this, stand close to there and you'll hear this high-pitched buzz noise that the bee makes, and that's what shakes the pollen free from those particular flowers. So really kind of a neat deal. And again, I'm sorry if the video didn't play very well, but unfortunately that's kind of the way it is these days. All right, so let's talk about plants and habitat considerations before we get to looking at the plants. First of all, natives, I'm always going to advocate for native plants, as I'm sure most of you are. Pollinators are adapted to them. The plants are adapted to our soils, our climate conditions. So it's a win-win situation. Select plants that have heads with multiple flowers, composites, for example, or flowers in clusters for the ease of foraging. So marble seed is a great one because it has lots of flowers in each of its different hanging branches. And penstemons have lots of flowers as well. And notice different shapes are going to attract different insects as well. Some have some flowers that have deep flowers, some that have shallow to accommodate insects that have different proboscis lengths. So think like a bee, think like a pollinator, and study what you've got coming to your plants in your garden. That's how you're going to learn this stuff the best, is to be out there actually observing, not just listening to me tell you something. Select flowers that provide nectar sources at different seasons. One of my goals is that I always have something blooming in my yard. And for the most part, I'm pretty successful. Even in December and January, I had a few dandelions, and then I had a few straggler daisies in select places. And then I even had a, oh my gosh, slender stem bitterweed that seemed to flower, and it's still flowering now. And it's got 4 flower heads on it right now in my yard. So think about year round, especially in this part of Texas, we can have things that are year round for them. And then select plants of different heights. That can be very valuable as well. Again, insects are different sizes. They have different needs. And then also, if you can find plants that are going to produce larvae for butterflies and moths, that's great too. So if they can double dip, why not? And then the other thing, and I've learned this recently, and if you go to my yard right now, I'm ashamed to say that I cut too many of the stems down this winter, but it turns out a lot of these native bees nest in dead stems, plant stems. A lot of times we get a plant dies and we go, okay, we got to clean that up because it looks ugly. I promise you, well, yeah, for the most part, promise you. I know Terry's on here. She might have to work that out with Terry. But anyway, she's very good about it. I'm going to leave more stems because those insects in the spring are going to lay their eggs in those tiny little stems because some of them are really, really tiny little bees and they need that in order to have a place to lay their eggs. So I've got to advocate for that. So now we'll just go through some plants. A lot of these you're going to know, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on how to identify them, but I'll try to give you some ideas of why I suggest these. Obviously, these are all great monarch and not viceroy, good God, Craig. And also for queens to lay their eggs on. And just to kind of give you an idea, I've never seen many monarchs on Texas milkweed, which by the way is a good shade loving milkweed. We have it growing very successfully in our backyard underneath pecan trees. But they have planted this in the demonstration garden at the Boerne Visitor Center. And Terry can tell you, and some of the other folks there can tell you that there were so many monarch caterpillars on this. They chewed that stuff down to nothing, including the caterpillars feeding on the ripening seed heads this last fall. I think it was August. It was during a hot part of the year, August, early September. But all of these are great plants for those two species of butterflies. And I should also say milkweeds are fantastic for all pollinators. So many different butterflies, moths, beetles, flies, and bees, of course, visit these flowers. They're very fragrant flowers, very attractive and good sources of nectar for so many different things. And these are just some other species that grow around here. I've seen swamp milkweed up along the river in that park near the library. It grows along the river there. Butterfly milkweed, this is another one the demonstration garden put in. And again, the monarch caterpillars just devastated these. They'll come back, but they put the hammer down on those as well. And then this one grows broadleaf milkweed. If those of you that like to go out to Big Bend area, you know broadleaf milkweed really well. Wonderful, big, robust plant. Grows also up in the Panhandle. Really, really neat plant. And then up in the Panhandle in certain locations, you'll find showy milkweed, one of the most fragrant flowers I've ever smelled. In fact, the first time I found this plant was in a marsh in Kansas. I was driving down the road with my windows open, bird watching, and this smell wafted in through my car windows, and I just immediately screeched on the brakes and had to explore and found these flowers. What a beautiful plant. So anyway, those are some of the milkweed examples. Of course, you can't go wrong with mist flowers and bone sets. These are some of the different mist flowers. The Greg's blue mist with the real toothy leaves is real common in a lot of gardens, mostly in the fall blooming, but is especially attractive to queens and monarch butterflies. Less so other species. I know other species use it, but it seems like the queens and the monarch really put the hammer down on it. And then blue mist flower, this one actually grows in marshy settings. It's at Cibolo Nature Center. It's down along the creek at Honey Creek. Its leaf is not as toothed as Greg's blue mist flower. So it's another nice one, and it seems to grow better in the shade than Greg's mist flower does. So I've got both of these species. And right now this one's winning because I have a lot of shade in my yard that I have to deal with. And then this is one, if you were going to be down in the lower Rio Grande Valley, blue bone set. Crucita, I've got a couple of these. I know they're not native to Kendall County, but it's a native Texas plant. So yes, I'm expanding my horizons here a little bit. But man, when it's in bloom, the butterflies, all butterflies, it doesn't matter. It's not just monarchs and queens, but all the sulfurs, the ladies, all of those things visit Crucita. Fantastic, fantastic plant for butterfly pollinators. And then of course, the one plant that, there are two plants that if somebody said that you can only plant two plants in your garden, this would be one of them, shrubby bone set. When it is blooming in the fall, everything stops and goes to this particular plant. It blooms for a long period of time, several weeks, tons and tons of flowers. And everything from bees to moths to this beautiful great purple hair streak, all kinds of things. It's a shrub that grows to about 6 feet tall around here, and just is prolific for pollinators, to the point where this fall I would go out in my front yard, and Terry can vouch for this. I would sit down in my folding chair with my camera, and I would literally spend hours sitting there trying to take pictures of all the pollinators that were coming in. Many of them to this day, I still don't know which ones they are because they're small bees and flies, but they're all very beautiful in their own right. So I'm an equal opportunity photographer of pollinators, regardless of who they are. The second plant that I would have in my yard over everything else is mealy blue sage on the left there. And then giant blue sage grows a little farther north. It's a little more robust plant, but really, really attractive to certain pollinators. But the nice thing about the mealy blue sage is, you all know, it starts blooming in the spring, and then it goes down, and then it blooms again and again and again. It does spread in your garden, but I don't care. The bees don't seem to care. The butterflies don't seem to care. So I just find this to be a wonderful, wonderful plant for a host of pollinators that might come to your yard or planting area. And then coneflowers. The one coneflower that's actually native around here is the pale purple. Purple coneflower is native in Texas, but more as of a tall grass prairie plant. You're going to find its native range is a little more limited, but it does very well here. And again, both of these are wonderful for attracting butterfly pollinators, some bees, but mostly butterflies, I notice. And then if you're out farther towards the Gulf Coast, this is a beautiful looking sanguine purple coneflower, very thin ray flowers, really pretty little plant. So I just highlighted that one as well. And then blazing stars, again, the late summer, early fall flowering. There are different species around the state, depending on where you are. Our particular species most commonly is the stiff blazing star, Liatris punctata. Very good pollinator plant, especially for butterflies, but also for bees and other pollinators. And then if you're up in the prairie, this thing's spectacular. Pycnostachya, and I'm sure I'm butchering that name because I don't know Latin. I should have taken Latin in high school, by the way. Everybody should have if you wanted to be a scientist, by the way. But this one can get to 4 or 5 feet tall in tall grass prairie, especially where it's a little wet. Fabulous, fabulous plant. One of the prettiest plants on a tall grass prairie in the fall you'll ever see. And then a couple of others from other parts of Texas. And then, of course, we have bee balm, different kinds of bee balms or horse mint. So lemon bee balm is really a good one for a lot of bees in particular. I guess maybe that's why they call it bee balm. But it's a good one. It's very pretty, I think. And we're going to see how well it spreads in my yard this next year. Also down farther in the San Antonio, you're going to find spotted bee balm. I think that's a beautiful flower. And so I wanted to highlight that one. And then if you're up a little farther north, I grew up north where we had wild bergamot. First of all, the leaves smell spectacular. And this is, if you're ever up in that area, watch for this plant because it's a very good one for pollinators of all different kinds. Then we have prairie verbena, a couple more lavender flowers here. Prairie verbena, I saw your pictures on there on your opening slideshow. Really good, blooms multiple times, very drought tolerant, seems like. And these are just examples of some of the insects, the butterflies that will visit these flowers, so that's great. And then one of my favorites, which is an annual, is basket flower. It is a really attractive, big flower, very attractive to the larger butterflies, including the swallowtails. Like you see here with the pipevine swallowtail. So absolutely beautiful flowering plant, I think. Grows in, blooms in May and June. And one of these flower heads, by the way, these are, one flower head can produce 120 seeds, by the way, just so you know. So as an annual, that's what you would expect. And once you have it established in your yard, the nice thing is you probably have it the next year as well. And I want to put a plug in for Texas thistle. I know a lot of people freak out when they see a picture of a thistle, but as you all know, this is our native. It doesn't go crazy like bull thistle and some of the others that are out there that are not native. And I wanted to show you also how many different things visit the Texas thistle. This thistle plant has several hundred flowers on it. The bull thistle can have upwards of 3,000 flowers, so you can imagine why it spreads so nicely and easily. But these are really attractive to a lot of different pollinators. I have still been unsuccessful in growing this in my greenhouse, but I'm hoping this year to get a couple of them. I'd like to have a couple in the yard. We'll see. And then, of course, for bees, now this isn't so much for butterflies, but for bees, The different kinds of penstemons work really, really well. The Gulf Coast penstemon, I was given that, and in my front yard is done spectacular for all kinds of bees of different sizes. And then Cobea is really a nice one. And then my favorite is the Scarlet Penstemon, which does very well here in the hill country, and is very attractive. And I just love penstemons. I think they're beautiful. Aren't they beautiful? I mean, look at them. And then, of course, for hummingbirds, but also one of the things, you know, when we talk about red flowers, a lot of times they say bees can't see red, and maybe insects maybe can't see red. But the one thing I can tell you is that when you have red flowers, whether it's cedar sage or tropical sage, especially in the fall when the sulfurs are around, and then these two, they will attract a lot of sulfur butterflies, and of course they attract hummingbirds. Turk's cap, of course, is a woody perennial, and standing cypress is a biennial. But again, two really beautiful red flowering plants that great for pollinators and just adding diversity to your yard. And so even if you're feeding hummingbirds with hummingbird feeders, having this plant right there in your yard is a great way to attract, kind of diversify their feeding, if you will. And then, of course, we have two different kinds of sage. We have the cedar sage that grows underneath cedar trees, even though I have some of it growing underneath and doing very well underneath a pecan tree in my yard. And then tropical sage, which is fantastic. It does spread, but in the fall, when other things are kind of waning and this is still blooming, again, lots of sulfur butterflies go to this. Different kinds of bees will visit these flowers. So again, you really, really a neat little plant. You kind of keep an eye on it a little bit. But you'll notice the tropical sage has the pointed tip on the leaf, and the cedar sage has the kind of crenate lobes or teeth around the edge, so it's more of a rounded leaf. Helps you identify it in the field. And then these two plants are great annuals to have in your garden just to add some color. Some insects use them. They obviously do because they produce a ton of seed, but probably a lot of your smaller bees and other pollinators like that are visiting these flowers, lots and lots of disc flowers in particular, and taking advantage of both of those. And then two of my fall favorites are the crown beards, the Verbecinnas, frostweed, and cowpen daisy. I will tell you, if you get cowpen daisy, once you get it in your yard, you will have it for a long, long time. We have discovered that, and this year we're going to try to control it a little better than last year because it went hog wild. But the bees and the butterflies loved it. And then frostweed, and by the way, cowpen daisy is an annual, so it comes back every year from new seeds. Frostweed is a perennial. We've used it in shaded areas, and again, both of these are incredibly important pollinating plants in the fall for migrating monarch butterflies. So if you have it in a yard or an acreage, don't destroy it. Let it grow, let it be there, so that when those butterflies are migrating through and other butterflies and bees are needing food in the fall, that these flowers are available for them. And of course, because I just have to do it, there's frostweed. You can take the most beautiful pictures of frostweed when those stems explode. One of the things I wanted to show you one time, I took a picture, a close-up in here. One of the things I noticed was this little reddish spot down here. I thought maybe some bird had bled there or gone to the bathroom there. And so I got down and I blew this picture up, and I actually discovered a guy actually out here climbing on the ice inside that formation, which I thought was just outstanding. So right now you're supposed to be laughing. So that's my joke for the night. So anyway, a few others. Maximilian sunflower, really tall, a robust plant, grows along a lot of our hill country roadsides. And again, it's always been said to be a good monarch plant. Finally, I got a picture of a monarch on one of the flowers. I love the flowers. If you take the flower head and squeeze it and put your nose in it, make sure there's no bees in there, I believe it smells like chocolate. And there you go, so you know. And then other yellow flowers in the fall. It's amazing how many yellow flowers are in the bloom in the fall. But goldenrods, the one goldenrod we grow very successfully is the showy goldenrod. I don't know if I'd recommend tall goldenrod unless you have an acreage and it's a little bit wetter, because it does tend to spread pretty good. But this is a beautiful plant. I know the fireplace over at Bergheim has a nice collection of these that were put in their landscaping several years ago. I do want to not forget about woody plants, especially this time of the year. As spring is coming on, Agarita is going to be blooming soon if it isn't already. And that flower, first of all, is super fragrant, but that is one of the most important flowers in the springtime when almost nothing else is blooming for those early emerging bees and butterflies. And if you have a good agarita plant with lots of flowers, you're going to see a lot of pollinator activity on those flowers. And later, of course, that's going to result in little red berries that you can use and eat, and they're delicious for preserves or just eating by the handful if you can get them out of there without stabbing yourself. And then, of course, Mexican plum. That's going to be blooming pretty soon, too. And it is one of the most fragrant flowers ever in the world. People should make perfume out of this stuff. It smells so good. And again, another one that's blooming so early that a lot of other things, flowering plants, not flowering plants, but herbaceous flowering plants are not blooming. So these become really magnets for our early season pollinators and nectar seekers. And then the other plant that I'm gonna give a plug for, I've learned a lot about this plant over the years. Tiny little flowers, waxy flowers. The males and females are on separate trees, as you probably know. What's shocking is how many different insects visit those flowers. And of course, that makes sense because they've got to spread the pollen from one plant tree to the other one that's female. Both of them are very fragrant, obviously. And one day at Honey Creek, when the monarchs were returning from the fall, their wintering grounds, I found this monarch actually nectaring on this tiny little flower. And then when we would as we conduct butterfly surveys now, we check the flowers of the Texas persimmon, because the early season butterflies like these juniper hair streaks just flock to this flower. So just to let you know about that, those things are out there. So very important. I'm turning my alarm off because it's going to go off in 1 minute. So anyway, so those are some of the plants that I've found to be very, very successful and very beneficial. I'm sure that some of you have noticed that as well, since you deal with native plants. A few things for attracting native plants: survey your yard or acreage first, find out what's there and what pollinator habitat you already have, and then protect those areas. A lot of those things we sometimes call weeds: straggler daisy, frog fruit, fantastic for lots of pollinators. And of course, cowpen daisy, I already mentioned. Snow on the mountain, when almost nothing else is blooming in August, snow on the mountain becomes a critical pollinator plant for the bees and the butterflies of all different kinds. Very important for the pollinators. So keep that in mind, that those things, you don't want them going crazy maybe, but you shouldn't eliminate them, because when other things are not blooming, these things will be providing nectar sources. I always say practice benign neglect. I had a shoulder injury several years ago, and I decided to run into the Discovery Center literally face first, and hurt my shoulder. The doctor told me, instead of doing operation, he said, we're going to practice benign neglect. And I thought that was a great way to also work in the garden. So I now promote that for the garden. Provide new habitat, of course, by adding new plants. Make sure, of course, you're considering sun exposure, because pollinators in particular really like the sunny open areas. And then also, again, I've mentioned this before, but look for plants that can serve as host plants for different butterflies. There's actually a really good book out there of host plants for Texas wildflowers and butterflies that just was published in the last couple of years. And then also focus on diversity, not only of species, but also, again, as I mentioned earlier, spring through fall. In the spring, when things get going good, I'll have everything from everywhere from 25 to almost 45 species of native wildflowers blooming at one time in the yard, between the front yard and the backyard. So I'm providing as much diversity as I can. And as time builds up, I think I'm going to continue to see an increase in the diversity of the pollinators that visit the yard. A few other things: stay away from pesticides if you can. Composites, of course, are top flight choices as nectar sources. The other thing is collect your seeds or purchase plants from local sources. Stay away from neonics. There's more and more research showing up that the neonicotinoids are showing up in the pollen, in the nectar. It's being residual in the soil. And as I tell people, basically, I really believe that these neonicotinoids are our new DDT. If those of you old enough to remember DDT and how it devastated birds and other wildlife, this is the next one right here, and it's all over us. It's all over the place right now, and something's got to be done about that, or we're going to see even more massive declines in our pollinator populations. When buying seed packets, what does it have? Read what's actually in the packet. If it has California poppy, put it back on the shelf. California poppy is not native to Texas. Why would you grow that plant? So a lot of times the clues as to how good a mix that is is among the label of the different species. And then again, observe, just become a good naturalist. Observe what's going on in your yard. A lot of times we plant things and then we walk away. We really don't look. We really don't go out and be good naturalists. Observe, observe, observe. And it'll be amazing what you discover. And then also just remember, diversity begets diversity. So keep that in mind. And then again, this, you can take a screenshot of this with your camera, your cell phone if you want to. I don't know if this is being recorded or not, but if it is, you can pick these up. These are some wonderful books that are out there. I certainly suggest checking into all of these. They're wonderful, wonderful places. There's that book by Jim and Lynn Weber and Roland Wauer on NAVTAV, host plants for Texas butterflies. Take that V out right there and it would be actually native. Anyway, so those are some suggestions for you. And I want to just briefly mention iNaturalist, because I work with iNaturalist all the time. If you're trying to figure out what's in your yard or in the park local that you're doing work on, iNaturalist is a great way to learn what those things are by taking a picture of it, sharing it with iNaturalist and that whole giant social network of people out there that are also learning right alongside you. It's a great way to connect people to nature. And also we use it in our program through our projects to actually gain scientifically valuable data as to the distribution of plants and animals throughout Texas. Globally, and this is probably a month old, there are well over 50 million, probably closer to 60 million observations now across the globe on iNaturalist. In Texas, we're closing in on 4 million observations, so that's pretty impressive. And that's one of the reasons Texas Parks and Wildlife decided, man, we can gain a lot of information off a project like this because of all the community engagement. So Texas Nature Trackers, we actually partnered with iNaturalist and began using it to host projects several years ago, well before my time. Basically what we do is we go out to the naturalist community across the state of Texas and educate people on iNaturalist and becoming citizen scientists, taking part in bioblitzes, things like that, to help document what's out there. Every county in Texas has one wildlife biologist, and I'll guarantee you they spend a lot of their time working with individual landowners, and they don't have time to be out there trying to document everything that's going on out there. So that's where the community science world can join us to help in that process. Because if we don't know where things are, we don't know what's what, how are we going to practice good conservation? So we need all of us to become engaged in this process, I believe. And then we take that data, we actually share it with the research and conservation community to actually get that onto maps so that we know where these things are. It allows us, and there have been cases now because partly because of iNaturalist, but other reasons, we've been able to delist, we've been able to take species off the species of greatest conservation need list, or we've had to add them because their populations are declining and we're not finding them anymore. So again, this information can really, truly be used for conservation. These are our 12 projects right here, and one, of course, is the Bees and Wasps Project of Texas. You'll notice a ton of observations. A lot of them, again, hundreds of species of bees and wasps, so they don't all get identified to species. It's okay. There is more and more talk now of starting to do some kind of a native bee annual survey across the country, similar to what they do with butterflies. So there's more and more, because there's more and more evidence that these animals are disappearing, and we need to take steps to not allow that to happen. Also for young users, and I also say for older people, is Seek. It's really easy to use. You don't have to have an account. You go out, take a picture, and as you're looking at the object, it's actually identifying it for you. So keep that in mind. So there's it's by iNaturalist. You can download that from the App Store, and you can use that as well. So that's an alternative if you don't want to use iNaturalist, but I really do encourage iNaturalist. In terms of pollinators, one of the things on our Texas Parks and Wildlife webpage, we have this amazing page for native pollinators and private lands. There are things on how to identify different species of bumblebees, native bee needs, native bee identification. There is a publication, management recommendations for native bee pollinators in Texas. It's a PDF. It is spectacular to learn as much as you want about pollinators and how you can help native pollinators across the state of Texas. Absolutely wonderful publication. And then finally, you can go to also National Wildlife Federation. They have all kinds of certification programs for wildlife habitat. And then I just want to show you, this is our front yard after we bought our house. This was our front yard last summer. So you can take the St. Augustine grass and turn it into something different. Don't look too closely because you're going to see a lot of Cowpendaisy in there. And I wanted, my last thing, and then I'm done, is to mention that from April 30th through May 3rd this year, the City Nature Challenge is going to go on again this year. We don't know if it's going to be a competition where everybody's out doing things because of COVID, or whether it's going to be individuals like it was last year. But I will tell you, we thought that the participation would go way down because of COVID. Turns out we actually set records for people getting out in their backyards and rediscovering that they actually have, or discovering that they have nature in their backyard, in their neighborhood parks, things like that. And of course, San Antonio includes all those counties. The poster on the right shows you all the counties that you can record that go into the San Antonio chapter, or the San Antonio project. So again, I encourage you to do that. If you want to learn more about the City Nature Challenge or using iNaturalist, so we're going to be offering workshops from now through May. We do it all year round, but we'll certainly be hitting it fast over the next 3 months. So watch for those on different outlets. There you go. That's what I have. Let me see if I can stop sharing my screen. Did that stop sharing my screen? I hope.
Yes,
Okay.
but I see your.
Is my presentation still on? Oh, no, here it is. Stop shares over here. There we go. How's that? Let me, yeah. Is that better?
So, Craig, check your chats. I'm sure you've got some questions.
Okay, let's see here. Let's see. Let's see. Oh, the video is playing good. That's good. What was that flower? I don't know what that flower was. Oh, marble seed. Cynthia Brown. It says, did he say marble flower? Marble seed is that name of that plant that bumblebee was nectaring on. Grows in wooded areas. It's a shade lover. I've seen hummingbirds nectaring on that. Monarch butterflies, the bumblebees. I've seen white line sphinx moths nectaring on. I've got videos of those. Pretty cool. Really, really neat plant. False Cromwell is the other name. There you go. There you go. Somebody did answer that. Let's see. Ocotillo, thank you very much. I can't believe I didn't remember that. Yes, Crucita seems to hard to survive here for more than 2 seasons. Amazingly enough, my plants that are up against the house did not die back. They're actually still growing. They're not flowering, but they're still growing with fresh leaves. And I will say that in terms of the deer, we have mealy blue sage outside our picket fence, and the deer don't touch it, at least not yet. Let's see here. Nancy Drucker talking about basket flower. Yes, yes, yep. There's a lot of it out there. Let's see here. Are Diospirus female and male flowers equally attractive? Yeah, they look identical. You actually have to look inside the flower to see that one of them has stamens and the other one is a pistil. So you have to look very closely at that. Benign neglect gets a thumbs up. I like that. Please repeat the #1 flower for pollinators. Well, golly, Glenda, that's not very fair. But if I had 2 choices, it would be shrubby boneset because of the diversity of things that come to it in the fall. But for year round, I'm going to pick mealy blue sage. Those are just my personal choices. But composite flowers are fantastic. Let's see, buying plants, do I ask if the plants have been treated? Absolutely. Absolutely ask if they've been treated with neonicotinoids. A lot of times if you go to the box stores, they won't know. Some of them have made pledges to not sell that kind of stuff again. I don't know if that's actually happening or not. If you can support local native growers, that's what I would do. And I'm sure hoping that they don't use neonicotinoids. Let's see here. Terry Lashley made a quote, pollination, the intersection between the plant and animal world. Absolutely it is. So there you go. If anybody has any more questions, I'm happy to answer those. Or otherwise, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Maybe you learned a thing or two. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk with you tonight.
Anyone have any more questions for Craig?
Thanks.
Craig, that was awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you, Craig. That was another wonderful presentation.
I'm thinking you ought to take that show on the road and sell tickets.
Well, you know, I do a lot of these presentations.
Very good. Very good.
So
I just wanted to make a comment. Don't forget prickly pear is
Yes.
an important plant.
It is. It is. It actually is. We've got it in our yard. Man, when it's blooming, especially the beetles go crazy for that thing. So yeah, I absolutely. That's another one. Yeah. If I were to try to do that, Delmer, and get them all, I'd be here all night, and you guys would all be asleep already. So, a man's got to know where the limit is.
Craig, can I take that reference page and put it on our Facebook page or our website?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I'm happy to share that. They're just books that are out there on the market. So,
Great.
yeah, absolutely.
Thanks very much.
Yep, you betcha.
Excellent presentation.
You bet.
Excellent. Bravo.
Thank you.
Bravo.
And somebody said, can we have a presentation on using iNaturalist? If you ever want one, I am happy to give you one. Normally we do those as workshops, so it's not, I can do it in an hour, but to really get a good iNaturalist workshop, it's usually a couple of hours, especially when it's online. We usually don't go more than 2 hours, but I'm happy to schedule one. I will be scheduling some. I've got some already. In fact, next week, I think I'm doing something on iNaturalist and City Nature Challenge through Bear Audubon. So if you go to Bear Audubon's webpage, you can find that presentation, sign up for it there. But anyway, there you go. And iNaturalist does have great videos, and it also has a great help area too, so you can learn too. So, and the website's fantastic too. And I'll stop talking now.
Okay, excellent. Anyone think of anything else other than a great big round of applause? You hear the roar, Craig? You hear the roar? The crowd is cheering. Yay. Excellent job.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the nice comments, everybody.